Welcome to the latest in the series of ASFP Getting Technical items. This series is apparently called Ask Andy, and in this series I'm going to be asked all the tricky questions that come in through our FAQs and web inquiries, and some selected ones get specially treated and I get to answer them in front of a camera. So if a primary beam passes through a compartment line, the amount of protection that's required will depend upon the fire resistance requirements of the compartment line. So if the compartment line has an integrity only performance, then you need to make sure that the fire cannot pass through the gaps around the primary beam, so that might need some form of detail, looking at using a fire resistant mastic to seal any openings as appropriate. If the compartment line has both an integrity and insulation requirement, then you will need to provide some level of secondary insulation along the structural steel to keep that so that the outer surface does not exceed the insulation requirements, which is an average temperature rise of 140 degrees C or a maximum temperature rise of 180 degrees C. And in that instance, yes, you're going to have to provide some extra insulation. I can't predict what that distance is or what that insulation is, but there are manufacturers out there with tested solutions for that precise scenario, predominantly using either mineral wool batt or boarding systems. Structural steel beams, when there is a concrete floor slab on the top of them, we actually test a structural beam with a concrete floor slab with the top flange unprotected and the concrete slab sat on top. That's a common testing scenario, and the certificates for beams will indicate three-sided performance with a concrete slab on top. And in those instances where you're looking at data of that ilk, then there is no need to protect the top flange, because that's the tested detail was tested unprotected beyond the addition of the concrete slab. If you've got a 2-hour beam that has a product on, and chances are, with it being a primary section, it's a bit heavier section than the secondary. So you've got an amount of product on your 2-hour primary beam, you have an amount of product that's applied as your loading for your 60-minute secondary. If the amount of material applied to the 60-minute secondary section is lower than the amount of product applied to the 2-hour primary section, you will need to uplift the amount of product applied to the secondary for a distance away from the primary section until it matches the thickness of product applied to the primary member. The distance of a material where you need to do that is given in ASFP Advisory Note 23. So there are a couple of ASFP documents that give advice on the interface between partition head tracks and protected primary steel sections. There is advice given in ASFP Advisory Note 18, and also there is detailed advice in ASFP Technical Guidance Document 13. A good way to do it, if necessary, is to offset the head track a little bit below the intumescent coated steel to allow for an expansion zone, and that's quite often done with the addition of Z-bars. there is obviously a cause for concern here, because the process of stud welding onto the top flange of a steel beam can allow the heat to be conducted through and cause the intumescent coating on the underside of that top flange to react. There is advice given in ASFP Technical Guidance Document 16, clause 3.5, on how to minimise the likelihood of that effect, and that considers the extent of stud welding and also the thickness of the steel flange. Beyond that, individual manufacturers might have evidence where they've looked at the effects of stud welding in terms of potential small blisters on the underside, but subsequent fire test to show that the fire resistance performance is still maintained.